My girlfriend insisted on play fighting that left me with black eyes and said I was ruining the fun when I asked her to stop. Cassidy punched me in the face for the first time 3 months into our relationship. We were watching a movie on her couch when she suddenly threw a playful jab at my shoulder. I laughed and pretended to block it, and she grinned and threw another one, harder this time. Before I knew what was happening, we were wrestling on the couch, her fists flying at my chest and arms. She caught me on the cheekbone with enough force that my eyes watered. I pulled back immediately, touching my face, and she froze with this concerned look that melted into a sheepish smile. She said she got carried away, that she forgot her own strength sometimes. She kissed the spot on my cheek and promised to be more careful. I believed her because I wanted to, because everything else about her was perfect. Cassidy was a personal trainer at the gym where I'd signed up 6 months earlier. She had this magnetic energy that drew people in, always laughing and encouraging her clients through brutal workouts. She was built like an athlete, all lean muscle and controlled power, and she moved through the world with absolute confidence. I was a graphic designer who spent most of my time behind a computer screen, softer around the edges, quieter in groups. When she asked me out after I'd been awkwardly lingering near the free weights trying to catch her attention for weeks, I couldn't believe my luck. Our first few months together felt like something out of a movie. She'd show up at my apartment with takeout, and we'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. She introduced me to her friends, all of them fitness people with loud personalities and inside jokes. I introduced her to my circle, mostly other designers and a few college friends, and she charmed every single one of them. The play fighting started gradually after that first incident. She'd poke me in the ribs when we were cooking together, then escalate to light punches on my shoulder. She'd tackle me onto the bed when I said something she thought was funny, pinning my arms and grinning down at me. At first, I thought it was cute, her way of being physical and playful, but the hits got harder. She'd punch my arm while we were driving, and I'd have to grip the steering wheel tighter to keep the car steady. She'd slam her palm into my chest when she wanted my attention, hard enough that I'd stumble backward. When I mentioned that she was hitting me pretty hard, she'd laugh and say I was being dramatic. She said play fighting was how she bonded with people, that it was just rough housing, totally normal. She said her brothers used to wrestle with her all the time growing up and she turned out fine. I wanted to believe her because the alternative meant admitting something was wrong, and I wasn't ready to face that yet. One night we were at her apartment and she wanted to wrestle. She said it would be fun, that we could test our strength against each other. I tried to laugh it off, saying I wasn't really in the mood, but she kept pushing. She started jabbing at my shoulders, dancing around me like a boxer warming up. I blocked a few of her hits, and she grinned wider, clearly enjoying herself. Then she threw a real punch at my stomach that knocked the wind out of me. I doubled over, gasping, and she immediately apologized, saying she miscalculated. She helped me to the couch and got me water, rubbing my back while I caught my breath. She said she forgot how much stronger she was than me, that she needed to remember I wasn't one of her gym buddies. I sat there trying to breathe normally while she kissed my temple, and some part of me knew this wasn't normal or okay, but I pushed that thought down deep. The bruises started appearing regularly after that. Purple marks on my upper arms, where she'd grabbed me too hard. Dark spots on my ribs, where she'd punched me during her playful moods. A black eye after she threw a pillow at my face, and her ring caught my eyebrow. I started wearing long sleeves even when it was warm outside, and I made excuses when people asked about visible marks. I told my coworker I'd walked into a door. I told my brother I'd taken up boxing. The lies came easier than I expected, maybe because part of me was already lying to myself about what was happening. Cassidy would see the bruises later and wince, saying she needed to be more careful, promising she'd control her strength better. But then a few days would pass, and she'd be roughhousing with me again, her fists connecting with my body in ways that left marks. My best friend Lucas noticed first. We were at a bar after work and I reached for my beer, my sleeve riding up enough to reveal finger-shaped bruises circling my bicep. Lucas stared at them for a long moment before asking what happened. I gave him the boxing excuse, but he didn't buy it. He asked if everything was okay with Cassidy, his voice careful and measured. I got defensive immediately, telling him she was great and everything was fine. He backed off, but his expression stayed concerned. He said if I ever needed to talk about anything, he was there. I changed the subject, and we didn't discuss it again that night, but I could feel him watching me more closely afterward, noticing things I tried to hide. Cassidy's play fighting intensified over the next few weeks. She'd challenge me to wrestling matches when her friends came over, showing off her strength by pinning me down while everyone laughed. She'd punch my shoulder repeatedly when she wanted to make a point during conversations, hard enough that I'd have to bite back winces. One night at a party, she demonstrated a chokehold on me, her arm tight around my neck, while she explained the proper technique to someone. I tapped her arm frantically when I couldn't breathe, and she released me with a laugh, saying I gave up too easily. Everyone thought it was, funny, this playful dynamic between us. Nobody saw how hard she was actually squeezing, or how my neck was sore for days afterward. I started researching domestic violence one night after Cassidy had gone home. I sat at my computer reading articles about abuse, looking for information that confirmed this wasn't what was happening to me. The articles talked about patterns of control and isolation, about emotional manipulation and escalating violence. I told myself it didn't fit. Cassidy wasn't isolating me from friends or controlling what I wore or where I went. She was just rough sometimes, too physical in her affection. But then I found articles specifically about female-on-male domestic violence, and the stories sounded uncomfortably familiar. Men describing bruises they hid, explaining away injuries, feeling embarrassed to admit their girlfriends were hurting them. One man wrote about how his partner would hit him and call it playing, how she'd laugh off his protests and make him feel like he was overreacting. I closed the browser feeling sick to my stomach. The black eye happened at Cassidy's gym. She'd invited me to work out with her on a Saturday morning, promising to show me some new exercises. The gym was nearly empty, just a few early morning regulars scattered among the equipment. Cassidy set up boxing pads and told me to practice my punches. I threw a few weak jabs and she laughed, saying I punched like I was afraid of hurting her. She told me to hit harder, to really put my weight behind it. I tried to throw a stronger punch, and she blocked it easily, then countered with a hit to my shoulder that made my whole arm go numb. She was grinning, clearly in her element, and she encouraged me to keep going. We went back and forth for a few minutes, me throwing careful punches while she blocked and countered with increasing force. Then she pulled off the pads and said we should spar for real. I told her I didn't know how to spar, that I'd never done any real fighting. She said it would be fine, that she'd go easy on me. She put on boxing gloves and handed me a pair, helping me secure the straps. We circled each other, and she threw a light jab that I barely blocked. She threw another and another, picking up speed. I tried to defend myself, but I had no idea what I was doing. Then she threw a hard cross that connected with my left eye. Pain exploded across my face, and I stumbled backward, my hands going to my eye instinctively. Cassidy pulled off her gloves immediately, rushing over to check on me. She said she was so sorry, that she got too into it, that she forgot I wasn't wearing headgear. My eye was already swelling shut, and tears were streaming down my face from the impact. Cassidy drove me home and made me an ice pack, fussing over me with genuine concern. She kept apologizing, saying she never meant to hurt me like that. She said sometimes she forgot her own strength, that training people all day made her too comfortable with physical contact. I sat on my couch with ice pressed to my face, feeling the throb of pain with each heartbeat. She stayed with me all day, bringing me food and painkillers, changing out the ice pack every 20 minutes. By evening, my eye was swollen completely shut, and the skin around it had turned deep purple. I took a photo in the bathroom mirror and stared at my reflection, this stranger with a battered face looking back at me. Cassidy appeared behind me in the mirror and wrapped her arms around my waist, resting her chin on my shoulder. She said I looked tough with a black eye, like a real fighter. Something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. Going to work on Monday was humiliating. My coworkers stared at my face and I repeated the boxing story, saying I'd started training and took a hit during sparring. Most people accepted the explanation with sympathetic noises, but my supervisor Rachel pulled me aside. She closed her office door and asked me directly if someone was hurting me. I felt my face flush hot, and I insisted everything was fine, that it was literally just a boxing accident. Rachel studied me for a long moment before saying she'd seen a lot of injuries in her time, and this didn't look like a typical sparring accident. She said if I ever needed to talk or needed resources, her door was always open. I thanked her and left her office quickly, feeling exposed and ashamed in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Lucas called me that evening after seeing a photo I'd posted on social media. I'd tried to angle the shot to hide the worst of the bruising, but he noticed immediately. He came over to my apartment without asking, showing up 30 minutes later with Chinese food and a determined expression. He took one look at my face, and his jaw tightened. He asked point blank if Cassidy did this to me. I tried to explain about the sparring, about how it was an accident, but Lucas cut me off. He said accidents happen once, not repeatedly. He said he'd been watching me for months now, Seeing the bruises I tried to hide, noticing how I flinched when people moved too quickly near me. He asked me when I was going to stop making excuses for her. I got angry then, defensive in a way that surprised both of us. I told Lucas he didn't understand our relationship, that Cassidy wasn't abusive, that we just had a physical dynamic. I said she was playful, and sometimes got too rough, but she always felt bad afterward. Lucas listened to me rant, and then asked quietly if I could hear myself. He said I was describing textbook abuse, the cycle of violence and apology that kept victims trapped. I told him to leave, my voice shaking with anger, and something else I didn't want to name. Lucas stood up slowly, his expression sad rather than angry. He said he'd be there whenever I was ready to admit the truth, but he couldn't watch me defend someone who was hurting me. He left, and I sat alone in my apartment with cold Chinese food, my black eye throbbing, wondering if he was right. Cassidy came over later that night and found me staring at nothing on my couch. She asked what was wrong, and I told her about Lucas's visit, about what he'd said. I expected her to be defensive or angry, but instead she looked hurt. She said it broke her heart that people thought she was abusing me when she loved me so much. She said yes, she played rough sometimes, but it was never malicious. She reminded me about growing up with brothers, about how physical affection was just part of how she expressed love. She said, if I wanted her to stop completely, she would, but it would fundamentally change who she was. The way she framed it made me feel guilty, like I was asking her to suppress her natural personality. I told her I didn't want her to change, I just wanted her to be more careful. She hugged me tight and promised she would be. For about a week, things were better. Cassidy was noticeably gentler with me, catching herself before punches landed too hard, asking permission before wrestling. I thought maybe we'd turned a corner, that she was finally understanding my boundaries. Then we went to a barbecue at her friend's house and everything fell apart. We were playing volleyball in the backyard, teams of 4 on each side. Cassidy was intensely competitive, spiking the ball with enough force to leave red marks on people's arms. I was on the opposite team, and at one point I managed to block one of her spikes. She laughed and called me a lucky shot. The next play, she spiked the ball directly at my face from close range. It hit me square in the nose and I went down hard, blood immediately pouring from my nostrils. Everyone rushed over, but Cassidy got there first, pulling me to sitting position and tilting my head back. She was apologizing profusely, saying it slipped, that she aimed for the corner and miscalculated. I sat there with blood running down my throat, my nose pulsing with pain, while people brought me towels and ice. Cassidy's friend Morgan knelt beside us and asked if my nose was broken. I didn't know, couldn't tell through the pain. Morgan offered to drive me to urgent care, but Cassidy said she'd take me, that it was her responsibility. In the car, my nose was still bleeding through the towel I held pressed to my face. Cassidy kept glancing over at me, her expression a mix of concern and something else I couldn't quite read. She said she was so sorry, that she never meant for this to happen. I didn't respond because I was too busy trying not to choke on my own blood. The urgent care doctor examined my nose and confirmed it wasn't broken, just badly bruised. She asked how it happened, and I told her about the volleyball game. She looked at me over her clipboard and asked if I felt safe at home. The question caught me off guard, and I stammered that, yes, of course. Why would she ask that? She said she had to ask everyone who came in with facial injuries. It was protocol. She gave me care, instructions, and a prescription for pain medication, then handed me a card with domestic violence resources printed on it. She said sometimes people need information for friends or for future reference, and I should keep it just in case. I took the card and shoved it in my pocket, feeling Cassidy's presence in the waiting room like a weight. We drove home in silence, and Cassidy helped me into bed, propping pillows behind me so I could sleep elevated. She brought me water and pills and kissed my forehead gently. She said she felt terrible about what happened, that she was going to be so much more careful from now on. I wanted to believe her, but the card from the urgent care doctor was burning a hole in my pocket. After Cassidy fell asleep beside me, I pulled out the card and read it in the dim light from my phone. The resources listed included hotlines, shelters, legal advocacy. I stared at the words, trying to reconcile them with my reality. I wasn't someone who needed a domestic violence shelter. I was a grown man in what I thought was a loving relationship, but I also had a black eye that was finally fading and a nose that hurt every time I breathed. I put the card in my nightstand drawer and tried to sleep. My mom called the next day and I made the mistake of answering. She immediately asked what was wrong because she could hear something in my voice. I told her I'd hurt my nose playing volleyball, and she asked to video call so she could see I was okay. I tried to refuse, but she insisted, so I angled the camera to minimize the bruising. It didn't work. My mom's face went pale when she saw me, and she asked what really happened. I stuck to the volleyball story, but she wasn't buying it. She said I'd had more injuries in the past 6 months than in my entire childhood, and she wanted to know what was going on. I felt something break inside me then, the wall I'd built to keep the truth contained. I told her about Cassidy's play fighting, about the bruises and the black eye and the nose injury. My mom listened without interrupting, her expression growing more distressed with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before asking if I understood what I was describing. She said Cassidy was physically abusing me, that there was no other word for it. I started to protest, but she cut me off firmly. She said intent didn't matter when the result was repeated injury. She said playing rough sometimes was one thing, but leaving bruises and black eyes was assault. She asked if I'd told anyone else, and I mentioned Lucas. She said I needed to listen to the people who loved me, that we could see what I couldn't from inside the relationship. She begged me to leave Cassidy, to come stay with her if I needed somewhere safe. I told her I'd think about it, but we both knew I wasn't ready to leave yet. The call ended with her making me promise to keep my phone charged and to call her if anything else happened. That conversation with my mom planted seeds of doubt that grew over the following days. I started paying closer attention to Cassidy's behavior, noticing patterns I'd dismissed before. She'd get a particular look in her eyes before she started roughhousing, almost predatory. She'd test my boundaries with small hits, gauging my reaction before escalating. When I pulled away or asked her to stop, she'd make me feel guilty, saying I was rejecting her or being too sensitive. She'd remind me how much fun we usually had together, how I'd never complained before. The manipulation was subtle, but once I started seeing it, I couldn't unsee it. I began documenting the injuries with photos on my phone, creating a folder I kept hidden. I wasn't sure why I was doing it, what I planned to use the evidence for, but some instinct told me I needed proof. Cassidy suggested we take a weekend trip to the mountains, rent a cabin, and disconnect from everything. I agreed, because I wanted to believe things could still be good between us. The cabin was beautiful, isolated and peaceful with stunning views. The first day was lovely, hiking and making meals together, sitting by the fireplace at night. But on the second day, Cassidy wanted to wrestle. She said she missed our physical play, that she'd been holding back too much lately, and it didn't feel natural. I told her I wasn't comfortable with it anymore, that I needed some space from that kind of interaction. Her expression shifted immediately, closing off in a way that made me nervous. She said I was being ridiculous, that wrestling was harmless fun. She moved toward me, and I stepped back instinctively. She noticed, and something flickered in her eyes, anger or frustration or maybe excitement. She grabbed my wrist and pulled me toward the open area of the cabin. I tried to resist, but she was stronger than me, had always been stronger. She got me in a headlock and took me down to the floor, her weight pinning me. I told her to stop, my voice strained, but she just laughed and said we were playing. She applied pressure to the hold and I couldn't breathe properly, panic starting to set in. I tapped her arm frantically and she held on for a few more seconds before releasing me. I scrambled away, gasping for air, my throat aching. She stood up, brushing off her clothes, and said I was being dramatic, that she barely even squeezed. I looked at her and saw a stranger, someone who got pleasure from hurting me, from seeing me scared. I told her I wanted to leave, to go home right now. She said we'd paid for the whole weekend and I was overreacting to nothing. We spent the rest of the trip in tense silence, and on the drive home I made a decision. I called Lucas as soon as I got back to my apartment. I told him he was right, that I needed help getting away from Cassidy. His relief was audible over the phone and he said he'd come over immediately. Lucas arrived with his girlfriend Sophie, who worked as a therapist specializing in trauma. They both hugged me and we sat down to talk through what needed to happen. Sophie explained that leaving an abusive partner could be the most dangerous time, that I needed to be strategic about it. She said Cassidy might escalate when she realized she was losing control, that I should prepare for her to try manipulation, threats, or increased violence. Lucas said I could stay with him for as long as needed, that his guest room was mine. Sophie helped me make a safety plan, identifying Cassidy's keys to my apartment that needed to be retrieved, important documents I should secure, people who should be informed for my protection. Over the next week, I prepared to leave while pretending everything was normal with Cassidy. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, smiling and acting affectionate while planning my exit. I slowly moved important belongings to Lucas's place, things Cassidy wouldn't notice missing right away. I changed my banking passwords and made copies of our lease agreement and other shared documents. I told my supervisor Rachel what was happening, and she helped me set up additional security at work, alerting the receptionist that Cassidy shouldn't be allowed up to our floor. Sophie connected me with a therapist who had experience with male abuse survivors, and I scheduled my first appointment. Everything was falling into place, but I felt sick with anxiety about the actual breakup conversation. I chose to do it in a public place, following Sophie's advice. I asked Cassidy to meet me at a coffee shop, saying I needed to talk about something important. She showed up looking curious but not concerned, ordering her usual drink and settling across from me at a corner table. I'd rehearsed what to say, but the words felt clumsy in my mouth. I told her our relationship wasn't working anymore, that I needed space to figure some things out. She looked confused and asked what I meant. I said I thought we should take a break, maybe see other people. Her expression darkened immediately, and she leaned forward, her voice low and intense. She asked if this was about the play fighting, if I was really going to throw away our entire relationship over some roughhousing. I tried to stay calm and explain that it wasn't just about the physical stuff, that I felt we weren't compatible in fundamental ways. Cassidy's voice got louder, and people at nearby tables started glancing over. She said I was being manipulated by Lucas, that he'd never liked her, and was turning me against her. She said we were perfect together and I was making a huge mistake. I stood up to leave, and she grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks, pulling me back down. I yanked my arm away and told her firmly not to touch me. The barista had noticed the commotion and was watching us carefully. Cassidy saw me looking at the barista and seemed to realize she was making a scene. She sat back and took a breath, her expression shifting to something softer, more pleading. She said she loved me, that she knew she'd messed up, but she could change. She promised she'd never roughhouse with me again, that she'd go to therapy, whatever I needed. I told her I'd already made my decision, and I needed her to respect it. She started crying then, real tears streaming down her face. She said I was breaking her heart, that she didn't know how to be without me. Part of me wanted to comfort her, old habits dying hard, but I forced myself to stay firm. I told her I'd packed up her things from my apartment and Lucas would coordinate returning them. I said I needed a clean break with no contact for a while. Cassidy's tears stopped abruptly, and she looked at me with cold calculation. She said I'd regret this, that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Then she stood up and walked out, leaving her coffee untouched on the table. I sat there shaking for several minutes after she left, adrenaline flooding my system. The barista came over and asked quietly if I was okay, if I needed them to call anyone. I thanked them and said I was fine, though I clearly wasn't. I texted Lucas that it was done, and he responded immediately saying he was proud of me. But as I drove back to my apartment to pack more of my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Cassidy's parting words echoed in my head, the threat implicit in her tone. I packed quickly, throwing clothes and essentials into bags, wanting to be gone before she showed up. I was loading the last bag into my car when I saw her truck pull into the parking lot. Cassidy got out and walked toward me with determined strides. I told her she needed to leave, that we'd already had our conversation. She ignored me and grabbed the bag I was holding, trying to pull it from my hands. We struggled over it briefly before I let go, not wanting to escalate to a physical fight. She threw the bag on the ground and stepped close to me, her face inches from mine. She said I didn't get to just leave, that she deserved better than being dumped in a coffee shop. I told her I'd done it in public specifically because I didn't feel safe being alone with her. Her eyes widened with hurt and anger, and she shoved me hard against my car. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I felt the door handle dig into my back. She shoved me again, and I held up my hands, telling her to stop. A neighbor from the next building over shouted asking if everything was okay. Cassidy stepped back immediately, her expression smoothing into something pleasant as she called back that we were fine. The neighbor wasn't convinced and walked closer. An older man named Richard, who I'd spoken to a few times. He looked at me and asked directly if I needed help. Cassidy interjected, saying we were just having a discussion, but Richard kept his eyes on me. I told him I was leaving and would appreciate if he could make sure Cassidy left too once I was gone. Richard nodded and positioned himself between us. Cassidy looked furious, but she couldn't do anything. With a witness present, I quickly loaded the last bag into my car and got in, locking the doors immediately. Cassidy stood there watching me, her expression promising this wasn't over. I drove away with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. When I got to Lucas's place, I practically fell through his door, and he caught me, helping me inside. I told him what happened with Cassidy showing up, and Sophie immediately said we needed to document it and consider a restraining order. Over the next few days, Cassidy bombarded me with texts and calls. At first they were apologetic, begging me to reconsider, promising she'd change. When I didn't respond, they turned angry, accusing me of leading her on and wasting her time. Then they'd swing back to pleading, saying she couldn't live without me. Sophie showed me the messages and pointed out the classic abuse cycle playing out in real time. She helped me draft a clear message telling Cassidy not to contact me anymore, that I considered the relationship over and any further contact would be harassment. I sent it and then blocked her number. She started calling from different numbers, leaving voicemails that ranged from tearful to threatening. I saved every message, every text, building a file of evidence. Cassidy showed up at my work 3 days after the breakup. The receptionist called up to warn me, and security was already on their way to escort her out. She made it to the elevator before they stopped her, and I heard her shouting my name from the lobby. Rachel came to find me, and we watched on the security monitors as Cassidy argued with the guards, her body language aggressive. They finally convinced her to leave, but Rachel said we should file a police report, that this was stalking behavior. I felt humiliated going to the police station, a grown man reporting his ex-girlfriend for harassment. The officer who took my statement was professional, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. He asked why I didn't just handle it myself, man to man. I explained that Cassidy was stronger than me, that she'd been physically abusive during our relationship. The officer's expression shifted slightly, and he asked if I had proof. I showed him the photos on my phone, the documented injuries, the threatening messages. He studied them for a long time before saying they could issue a restraining order if I wanted to pursue it. I left the police station with paperwork for a protective order and instructions on how to file it with the court. Lucas had taken the afternoon off to come with me, and we sat in his car afterward, both of us processing what had just happened. He said he was sorry I had to go through this, that he wished he'd intervened sooner. I told him it wasn't his fault, that I hadn't been ready to hear the truth until recently. We drove back to his place, and Sophie had dinner waiting, creating a space that felt safe and normal. But that night I lay awake in Lucas's guest room, jumping at every sound, convinced Cassidy would somehow find me there. The hypervigilance was exhausting, my body stuck in fight-or-flight mode even when I was supposedly safe. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. In the meantime, Cassidy's harassment continued through social media, through mutual friends, through showing up at places she knew I'd be. She came to the climbing gym where Lucas and I went on Thursday evenings, watching us from across the room until we left. She followed my car after work one day, staying several car lengths back, but definitely tracking me. I called the police each time and filed reports, adding to the evidence file for court. Sophie suggested I start seeing the therapist she'd recommended, someone named Dr. Yolanda Wright, who specialized in trauma and abuse recovery. My first session with Dr. Wright was uncomfortable, sitting in her office trying to explain why I'd stayed with someone who hurt me. She listened without judgment and helped me understand the psychological mechanisms that kept abuse victims trapped. She said shame was a powerful silencer, that male victims especially struggled to come forward because society told them they should be able to defend themselves. We talked about how Cassidy had gradually escalated the violence, testing my boundaries and normalizing behavior that should have been red flags. Dr. Wright explained that abusers often chose partners they perceived as vulnerable in some way, people who were kind and empathetic and likely to make excuses for bad behavior. She said, my tendency to see the best in people had made me an easy target. The sessions helped me start processing what had happened, giving me language to describe experiences I'd minimized for months. I started sleeping better, though I still had nightmares about Cassidy breaking into Lucas's apartment. I started eating regularly again, realizing I'd lost weight from stress without noticing. Small pieces of myself were coming back, fragments I hadn't realized were missing. The restraining order hearing arrived, and I sat in the courthouse lobby feeling sick with anxiety. Cassidy was already there with a lawyer, someone she'd clearly paid good money for based on his expensive suit. She looked different, softer somehow, wearing a dress instead of her usual athletic clothes. Her lawyer approached me and introduced himself, saying his client wanted to resolve this without a hearing. He said Cassidy was willing to agree to a mutual no-contact order if I dropped the stalking allegations. Sophie, who'd come as my support person, immediately said no. She pointed out that mutual orders implied both parties were at fault, which wasn't true. She said we had extensive documentation of Cassidy's abuse and harassment, and we were confident the judge would grant a full protective order. The lawyer's expression tightened, and he went back to confer with Cassidy. When we went into the courtroom, the judge reviewed my Evidence file carefully. I'd included photos of injuries, medical records from urgent care, screenshots of threatening messages, security footage of Cassidy at my workplace, and police reports documenting her stalking behavior. Cassidy's lawyer tried to argue that the relationship had been mutually physical, that I'd participated in the roughhousing willingly. I testified about asking her to stop repeatedly, about feeling scared and controlled, about the escalating violence. The judge asked Cassidy directly if she'd caused the injuries documented in my photos. Cassidy admitted she had, but said they were accidents during playfighting. The judge said intent was irrelevant when someone repeatedly asked for physical contact to stop, and it continued anyway. She granted a protective order for 1 year, requiring Cassidy to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, and my workplace. Cassidy's face went red with anger, but her lawyer kept her quiet as we left the courtroom. I walked out of the courthouse feeling like I could breathe fully for the first time in months. Sophie hugged me and said she was proud of how I'd handled everything. Lucas had taken the day off work to be there, and the three of us went out for lunch, a small celebration of this major victory. But as we ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that Cassidy wouldn't respect the order, that she'd find a way to get to me anyway. Sophie seemed to sense my anxiety and said violation of a protective order was a criminal offense with serious consequences. She said if Cassidy was smart, she'd accept the boundaries and move on. I wanted to believe that, but I knew Cassidy didn't handle losing well. For several weeks, things were quiet. Cassidy didn't contact me or show up anywhere I went. I started to relax incrementally, letting my guard down in small ways. I moved out of Lucas's guest room and into my own apartment, a new place Cassidy had never been. I went back to my normal routines without constantly looking over my shoulder. Work became easier without the fear of her showing up in the lobby. I continued therapy with Dr. Wright, processing layers of trauma I hadn't fully acknowledged. She helped me understand how the abuse had affected my sense of self, how I'd learned to minimize my own needs and boundaries to keep Cassidy happy. We worked on rebuilding my confidence and learning to trust my own perceptions again. Then one night I was leaving the grocery store and found my car tires slashed. All 4 of them, cut deep enough that they'd need to be replaced entirely. I stood there staring at the damage, knowing immediately who'd done it but unable to prove it. I called the police and filed a report, but without security camera footage or witnesses, there wasn't much they could do. They said it could be considered a protective order violation if I could prove Cassidy did it. I called my insurance company and arranged for my car to be towed to a shop, then called Lucas for a ride home. He picked me up and we drove past Cassidy's gym on the way, where her truck was parked in its usual spot. She had an alibi, was probably teaching a class or training clients at the exact time my tires were slashed. But I knew it was her, felt it in my gut. More incidents followed. My apartment door was keyed, long scratches gouged into the paint. Packages were stolen from my doorstep. Someone filed a false noise complaint against me with my landlord. Each thing alone could be coincidence, but together they formed a pattern of harassment designed to remind me Cassidy could still reach me. I documented everything, took photos and filed reports, but without proof it was her, the police could only add it to my file. Dr. Wright said this was a common tactic, abusers finding ways to maintain control without technically violating protective orders. She said I needed to be extra careful about security, to vary my routines, and stay aware of my surroundings. The hypervigilance I'd been working to overcome came roaring back, my nervous system stuck in high alert. Sophie suggested I hire a private investigator to document Cassidy's movements and possibly catch her in the act of harassment. It felt extreme, but I was desperate for peace, so I hired someone her firm recommended. The investigator, a woman named Veronica Chen who'd worked law enforcement for 20 years before going private, said she'd handled cases like mine before. She set up surveillance on my apartment and tracked Cassidy's known locations and patterns. After 2 weeks, Veronica called me with news. She'd captured footage of Cassidy's truck driving past my apartment multiple times late at night, despite the protective order requiring her to stay 500 feet away. She'd also documented Cassidy parked outside Lucas's building, clearly watching for me even though I no longer lived there. The evidence was clear and undeniable. Veronica said I had grounds to report the violations and pursue charges. I took the evidence to the police, and this time they took it seriously. They issued a warrant for Cassidy's arrest for violating the protective order. She was picked up at her gym the next day, arrested in front of her clients and coworkers. Lucas called me when he saw it reported on the local news, a brief story about a fitness trainer arrested for stalking. Part of me felt vindicated, but mostly I felt exhausted. I'd wanted this to be over when the protective order was granted, but it just kept going. Cassidy was released on bail within hours, and her lawyer immediately filed a motion to dismiss the charges. He argued the truck footage wasn't conclusive, that anyone could have been driving it. But Veronica had also captured images of Cassidy herself sitting in the vehicle, her face visible in the streetlight. The lawyer's motion was denied, and a trial date was set. The weeks leading up to trial were tense. Cassidy's lawyer tried multiple times to get me to drop the charges, offering various deals and compromises. He painted her as a heartbroken ex who'd made mistakes but didn't deserve criminal charges. I refused every offer, determined to see this through. Sophie connected me with a victim's advocate from the prosecutor's office who helped me prepare for testimony. She said the trial would be difficult, that I'd have to relive everything in front of strangers and Cassidy herself. But she also said my case could help other male abuse victims feel less alone, that representation mattered. I thought about all the articles I'd read in those desperate early days, looking for stories that matched my experience. If sharing my story could help even one other person, it was worth the discomfort. The trial took 3 days. I testified about the progression of abuse, the injuries, the way Cassidy had dismissed my boundaries and made me feel crazy for objecting. The prosecutor showed the photos of my black eye, my bruised arms, my injured nose. They played security footage of Cassidy confronting me at my workplace. Veronica testified about the surveillance evidence, the protective order violations documented over weeks. Cassidy's lawyer tried to paint me as a willing participant who'd changed his story after the relationship ended. He suggested I'd enjoyed the roughhousing and only complained when I wanted out. But the medical records and contemporaneous police reports contradicted that narrative. The prosecutor's closing argument was powerful, stating that abuse doesn't stop being abuse just because the victim is male, that physical violence is wrong regardless of gender dynamics. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Cassidy showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but her lawyer looked defeated. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks out, and Cassidy was remanded to custody pending that hearing. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in a year. Lucas and Sophie were waiting, and we stood on the courthouse steps in the afternoon sun, just breathing. Sophie said this was a significant precedent, that female-on-male domestic violence cases rarely made it to trial, let alone resulted in conviction. She said my willingness to come forward had created visibility for an underreported problem. I felt proud, but also sad, that it had been necessary, that the system had made it so hard to get help. Sentencing day arrived, and the courtroom was packed with domestic violence advocates, reporters, and people I'd never met who'd followed the case. The judge allowed me to give a victim impact statement before sentencing. I stood at the podium and looked at Cassidy in her orange jumpsuit, this person who'd claimed to love me while systematically hurting me. I talked about the physical injuries, but also the psychological damage, the way she'd made me doubt my own perception and minimize violence against my body. I said I'd spent months ashamed to admit what was happening because society told me men should be able to defend themselves. I said her abuse had stolen my sense of safety, had made me afraid of intimacy and vulnerability. I said I was still in therapy working to rebuild trust in myself and others. When I finished, several people in the courtroom were crying. The judge thanked me for my courage in coming forward and turned to address Cassidy. She sentenced Cassidy to 18 months in jail, followed by 3 years of probation. She said domestic violence was serious regardless of the genders involved, that physical abuse could never be dismissed as playfulness. She ordered Cassidy to complete a batterer intervention program and anger management counseling as conditions of her probation. She extended the protective order for 5 years post-release. Cassidy finally showed emotion then, tears streaming down her face as the bailiff led her away. I felt no satisfaction in her tears, just exhaustion and relief that it was finally over. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked if I wanted to make a statement. I said I hoped my case would encourage other male abuse survivors to come forward, to know they'd be believed and supported. The story ran on local news that night and went viral online, sparking conversations about domestic violence and gender assumptions. 2 years later, I sat in Dr. Wright's office for what would be one of our final regular sessions. We'd transitioned to monthly check-ins after I'd made significant progress in processing the trauma. I told her about my new relationship with someone I'd met through mutual friends, how different it felt to be with someone who respected boundaries and communicated clearly. I said I'd become involved with a men's support group for domestic violence survivors, helping facilitate meetings and sharing my story with others who needed to hear they weren't alone. Dr. Wright smiled and said she was proud of how far I'd come, from someone who couldn't name what was happening to him to an advocate helping others escape similar situations. I thanked her for helping me find my voice again, for teaching me that vulnerability wasn't weakness, and asking for help was strength. As I left her office, I thought about Cassidy sometimes, still in prison, but mostly I thought about the future. I'd survived something that could have destroyed me, and I'd chosen to transform that pain into purpose. My black eye had healed long ago, but the internal scars took longer, required more care. I was still healing, would probably always be healing in some way, but I was whole enough now to help others start their own journey toward safety and peace. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.